Hey everybody, so I want to talk about teams that are currently outside of the playoff picture. They're not in a playoff position right now that could potentially work their way back up and make the playoffs this season. Now, before we get started, I just want to say if you're not yet a subscriber to this channel, please hit that subscribe button. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Both those things would greatly help me out a lot, so thank you. But I will say that I think the teams that are in the playoffs right now are going to be very close to being the teams that end up in the playoffs come, April. Now, sure, there could be a few changes. A couple of teams could drop out. A couple others could move in. But I don't think there's going to be any drastic change to the playoff structure. I think the teams that are in playoff spots right now have a very good chance of being the teams that make the playoffs come April this season. And there aren't many of these teams that are currently outside of the playoff picture that I think really have much of a shot of getting in. So what I've done is I've listed in their standings order the teams in the West and the East who are currently outside of the playoffs. So in the Western Conference, Dallas is the first team out, Minnesota's second, Vancouver's third, and so on. And in the East, Pittsburgh's the first team out, the Rangers are second, Ottawa's third, and so on. Let's start in the Western Conference, and let's start at the bottom, because these are teams that have no shot of getting in. The Los Angeles Kings are not going to the playoffs. The Chicago Blackhawks have no shot of going to the playoffs. Arizona is not going to the playoffs. They're too young, and they've lost their starting goaltender for probably the entire season in Antti Raanta. So those three teams are not going to the playoffs. There's virtually zero shot of them making it. St. Louis has played less games than most of the other teams. They've only played 32 games so far. However, this season's been an absolute dumpster fire for the Blues. But there's so much talent on that team, I don't want to completely count them out, because if they make one big trade that completely changes things, they could rip off a 10 game win streak, and then they're right back in it. I feel like with most teams in the situation that St. Louis is in, I would be Xing them out immediately. No thought about it. But there's just so much talent in St. Louis, it's hard to count them completely out. They shouldn't be this bad. They shouldn't be. They should be up here with Minnesota and Dallas, or even in a playoff spot. But they're not, because everything just seems like they've been such an absolute disaster this season. I don't want to X them because I feel like they could make a run, but I've seen nothing this season that makes me think that that's actually going to happen. I haven't seen anything from them that makes me think that they can actually rip off a run like that, even though they are a talented team. So St. Louis, you are not making the playoffs. Vancouver is not making the playoffs. Vancouver's played more games than everyone else, so everyone has games in hand on Vancouver. So that leaves Minnesota and Dallas out west, and I do think that those two teams still have a chance of getting in. Dallas, absolutely. Minnesota as well. Minnesota, they started the season really, really good, and then they've fallen flat on their faces. I think they're 3-7 in their last 10 games. They've dropped well out of a playoffs. Well, not well out. They're only out of the playoffs by, I think, 3 or 4 points. But they're out of the playoff spot now, from when they were as high as second earlier this season. I don't know what's happening in Minnesota. Was the hot start just them overachieving, and this is actually what they are, a borderline playoff team? Or have they just been playing poorly recently, and are they going to go back at some point in the second half of the season and become be the team that they were at the beginning of the year? If they do that, they can pull themselves right back into a playoff spot. They're only a few points out. So I can't completely count out Minnesota. Although I really don't know what's going on with that team. They should be better than what they are. They have not been playing well lately. And Dallas, another team with a chance. They're not in playoff position right now. They were in playoff position as a wild card team for a good portion of this season. But they've really fallen off. They're good at home, though. Dallas is bad on the road, but really good at home. So if they can continue to dominate at home, then they might win enough games to sneak in and maybe a wild card spot. But they certainly still have a chance. You can't count out the Stars yet, or Minnesota really. The rest of this team, I don't think the rest of this conference, I don't think really has a chance. I think the teams that are in the playoffs out west now are either going to make it, or Dallas or Minnesota could take one spot away. Probably not both, but maybe take one spot away, and that would be the only change. Moving over to the East, New Jersey is done. New Jersey stinks this year. They're done. Philly, they're done. They took too long to make changes. They didn't. Last night was Scott Gordon's first game as head coach of the Flyers. They won. They beat Detroit 3-2. Carter Hart played his first NHL game and won. But Philly waited too long to make changes. They are not going to surpass all of these teams and at least one team that's already in a playoff spot. It's just not going to happen. They're in too big of a hole. Florida, I don't want to count out because they've played fewer games than most teams. They're 500 right now, and there's a lot of talent there. Florida should be a lot better than what they are this season. I don't know why they're so low in the standings. Well, they're so low in the standings because they haven't won games, but I don't know why they're not winning games. There's a lot of talent there. They should be better than this. They just haven't put it together. They're inconsistency. They are one of the most inconsistent teams in the league. Some nights Florida looks like it could compete with Tampa Bay and Toronto in the Atlantic. Other nights they look like they belong down with Philly and New Jersey. They're so inconsistent. I'm not going to completely count out Florida because we saw the run that they made in the second half of last season and almost got into the playoffs. They were 1 point shy of making the playoffs last season. I can't completely rule out the possibility of them doing that again. Maybe they're on a 2-game win streak now. Maybe if they win the rest of their games before Christmas, get that win streak up even higher, and then maybe come out of the Christmas break with 3 or 4 wins, then you've put a 7-8 game win streak together. They could rise in the standings pretty quickly doing that. So I'm not going to completely count out Florida, but they have a slight chance of moving back in to a playoff spot. I had them in the playoffs to start this year, but hasn't looked good so far. For them to get in, they're going to have to knock out Buffalo, Boston, or Montreal. One of those teams is going to have to go for Florida to get in, and I don't know if Florida is good enough to knock one of those 3 teams out. If any, maybe Montreal, maybe Boston. But Boston's getting Patrice Bergeron back, hopefully soon. There's been reports he could be back this weekend. If Boston gets Bergeron back and Bergeron is himself and healthy, then Boston's going to go right back up to competing with Toronto and Tampa Bay. So, do they knock Buffalo out? Do they knock Montreal out? Florida's chances are very, very slight at this point. Detroit, I don't think they have much of a shot. Detroit's just not a playoff team. There's some really good young pieces there, but they're not a playoff team yet. Carolina is not a playoff team. I don't see anything in Carolina that makes me believe that they're going to go on some sort of big time run and pull themselves into a playoff spot. I think they're about a 500 team, which is where they're at right now in the standings. I think that's where they'll probably stay. Ottawa has overachieved greatly to this point in this season, and they're still not in the playoffs. I don't see them keeping this up all season long. I don't really know how Ottawa is as high as they are in the standings, how they've won this many games. This is not a good roster. This is not a team that should be good. They're still not a playoff team for sure. They have no shot of getting in. But it's been a much better year for Ottawa than a lot of people expected. That leaves the Rangers and Pittsburgh, and they're both getting check marks. It's hard, you can't count either of those teams out to this right now. New York I don't know how they're as high in the standings as they are. They should not be good. when you look at their roster, they should be one of the worst teams in the East, and they're not. They've won way more games than I think many people expected them to. I know way more than I thought they'd win, to this point at least. They're putting together an actually a pretty good season with limited resources. They're a rebuilding team, but they're putting a much better team on the ice than they really should be. And they're only a few points out, so it's really hard to, you can't count them out right now. They're right there. They're right there in the Metro. If they could continue to overachieve, then they could sneak into a wild card spot. They could snag that third spot, depending on what the Islanders and Penguins do. It's possible. And Pittsburgh, I think Pittsburgh does end up in the playoffs, whether it's as a wild card team or taking the third or even second spot in the Metro. But I can't imagine Pittsburgh not making the playoffs. I just can't picture that. I can't picture a playoff season this year in 2019 without the Pittsburgh Penguins. They've had a really bad start. They're out of the playoffs right now. They haven't looked like the Penguins. They haven't, been a really all that great of a team. Haven't even really been a good team this year. But I just can't picture the playoffs without Pittsburgh. So I think that at some point they're going to work themselves back in. Definitely probably as a low seed, but I do think they're going to make the playoffs. So really, when you look at it, I only think that there are only 4 or 5 teams that even have a chance of pulling themselves into playoff spots at this point. Even in Florida is an absolute long shot. I don't really know why I'm not counting them out. I feel like they could maybe sneak in, but when you look at this, I mean, the teams that are in the playoffs right now are probably going to be the teams that make the playoffs, or at least a large majority of them. Maybe 1 or 2 teams switch, and one falls out and one goes in, but I don't think there's going to be a lot of changes from now to the end of the season as far as who's a playoff team and who's not. Dallas and Minnesota certainly have a shot. Pittsburgh and New York definitely still have a shot. Florida has a very, very slight chance. No one else I can really see pulling themselves in. I mean, Vancouver, no. St. Louis, probably not. Arizona, Chicago, and LA, definitely not. Philly and New Jersey are done. Detroit's not a playoff team. Carolina, Ottawa, I don't see any of them being good enough to just pull themselves in to playoff position. I think some of these teams are overachieving as it is, and they're not even in the playoffs picture. So, that's just what I think. I don't think there's going to be much change between now and the end of the season as far as, the standings and who's seeding may change, where teams are in the standings may change. But as far as who's a playoff team and who's not, I don't think that changes much the rest of the year. So, with that, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media, check out offthewallhockey.com. All those links are in the description below. If you'd like to further support the channel, the links to our Patreon and merchandise store are in the description as well. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.